Is the American empire declining like the other great civilizations? First, we have to ask ourselves the questions, what brought down these other civilizations? The Guptas fell due to infighting and breaking away into different states, and then they got conquered little by little. The caliphates expanded extremely quickly, and they relied on a slave army to keep everything in tow. Eventually, that slave army revolted, and that became the Ottoman Empire. Rome overexpanded and had to keep expanding in order to pay for the resources to overexpand. The majority of the army came from people that they conquered. Their currency turned to nothing, and they failed to keep up with a lot of military tactics. The Mongolians also overexpanded, conquering the largest empire in the world. They conquered several powerful empires, so of course when Genghis Khan died, these other empires just reclaimed power. The British fell because of course they overexpanded. Maintaining all of these conquered colonies was a huge drain on resources, and a lot of their army did consist of the people that they conquered. World War I and World War II were also the nail in the coffin of British power. Then comes the US, which attained dominance in two ways. Right now, the US military has the most powerful weapons, and we have more bases all around the world than anywhere else. The US military can mobilize very quickly at any point in the world. All of our competitors or potential enemies are surrounded by our allies. But the United States pretty much conquered the world with the dollar after World War II. Nearly all of the 195 countries on Earth are dependent on the US dollar for some kind of economic survival. All of those other empires had to have boots on the ground in order to maintain dominance on those colonies and take their resources. The only thing the United States needs to keep dominance is making sure that country has a bank. But of course, problems. The Chinese economy is rising as an economic competitor to the dollar empire, and their military is nothing to laugh at either. Here is a chart showing the US dollar's dominance as a reserve currency from 1900 to 2020. You can see it peaked in 2000, but between 1960 and 2020 it has been fairly consistent. Yet Chinese currency only makes up for 2.3% of world reserves, while the euro is 21.2%. And then there's the SWIFT International Payment Network, which is owned pretty much by the US. This is the main avenue for all electronic payment processings in world trade. When the US cut Iran out of SWIFT, they lost 30% of oil revenues the following year. And these BRICS have a problem with the US having this kind of one-sided power. And can you blame them? There should be some kind of competition. My opinion is that it won't work out too well because none of these leaders will trust each other. But even if it did work out, that wouldn't be the end of the American empire. The British Empire still did very, very well, and they were surrounded by enemies for hundreds of years. They had to contend against France, Spain, the Netherlands, all empires. Yet Britain still remained on top for 3 centuries, even though they faced that kind of competition. Competition would incentivize the US to perform better. China has been making some progress against SWIFT, but they do have a long way to go. And even China heavily relies on SWIFT and the other economic platforms of the US. The US may not have complete dominance in the future, but my opinion is that they will still be on top. Like I mentioned before, the US doesn't just maintain its dominance through its military, it does it through economics and the use of the dollar. If you look at that chart, you'll see the percentage breakdown of global currencies. In 2020, it was 59%, but right now it's about 60.1%. The Chinese renminbi, which has the yuan as a unit, is 2.3% of all reserves, and the euro is just 21.2%. And right now, the euro, the yen, the pound, the Chinese renminbi, these are all losing their strength against the dollar. This is the most recent table of China's currency against our dollar, and this is a current chart of the US dollar index, which is compared to a huge basket of other world currencies. Whenever we're above 100%, that means we are on top of those other currencies. But the most important indicator of the dollar's strength is how it is relative to gold. And what you're looking at here is the entire history of the price of gold since the 1970s. People say because the price of gold has risen so much against the dollar over the past 20-30 years that the dollar is becoming worthless. No. Around this time, 2002, Russia, India, and China, these huge economies, started buying massive amounts of gold every single year, which just increases the value of gold, which we have had and accumulated even before this time. Now, during the rise of COVID, the value of gold went up because people were dumping their currencies for something more rock hard and safe. Yet over the past 6 months, the value of gold to the dollar has actually gone down by almost 30%, which shows a huge growing in strength of the US dollar. So the notion that our currency is worthless has no base. A lot of people talk about the total debt and how it's going to destroy everything. And then the US owes a little over $7.5 trillion of foreign debt. The US produced about, 40% of all dollars in circulation over the past 2 years. That limits the value of the US debt that we have to the other countries. So the US pays a lot of that debt off with our currently cheap dollars. That's one of the perks of being the buyer and the seller of your currency. And of course, none of the BRICS countries are going to like that because they see their balance sheets drop by a lot, and they see the leverage of debt that they were holding just start to dwindle and then get paid off. Now there's the $30 trillion in public debt that everyone's worrying about. Who did we borrow this money from? We didn't borrow it from any other country in the world. We borrowed it from ourselves. And this isn't debt like you would think of credit card debts or even bank loan debts. These debts are bought in the form of treasuries, which have some of the lowest interest rates, or trust funds. And the amount of debt is actually a red herring for something that's important. What we should be looking at is the amount of debt compared to our GDP. It has been this high before, during World War II. Funny thing about that is, shortly after we doubled the minimum wage for workers in 1950 and started matching their payments to rise with inflation, look what happened to all of the public debt. Now we are at these World War II levels. My opinion is that we've gone through tough times like this before. Here are some facts and figures about the military powers of the world. China has the world's largest navy. Check that out, 777 ships. Look at us, we only have 490 ships. But when it comes to tonnage of ships, we actually have 4 times more than our closest rival, Russia. All these countries have tiny, tiny little ships, and we have massive battleships, giant aircraft carriers, which is why we get to patrol the world's seas. And now let's go to air forces. All right, the U.S. Air Force has 5,200 planes. Russia's right behind us, 3,800. Now let's just look at total planes. The Army itself has more airplanes than Russia. And then right below Russia, it's the United States Navy. So the U.S. actually has over 13,000 planes it can use in the military, while the close second, not even a third. And now let's just look at most powerful air fleets. U.S. Air Force is number 1. The U.S. Navy is number 2. Russian Air Force is number 3. But then the Army is number 4 and the Marines are number 5. So we dominate the air. The one thing we are second in is nukes. Russia just has a lot more. We have this many. But really, how many times are you going to blow up the world? And then there's drones. Who is the number 1 producer and user of drones? The USA. We have over 10,000 of the best. So our numerical and technological superiority can be implemented in several different parts of the world, as we have more bases scattered throughout the world than any other country. Another big thing I hear is, well, we have to worry about the hypersonic missiles. Fun fact, the US shelved hypersonic missiles in the 70s. We have been catching up and growing that technology. Now, a few years ago, there was a certain country, won't say its name, that launched a hypersonic missile, and it went around the world 1.5 times without official sources recognizing what happened. And so many people in the US were like, oh my gosh, we're doomed. We don't have that kind of technology. That missile was 25 miles off of its target. That is not what you call mission success. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard that the US loses in military simulations against China and Russia, and we lose poorly. Right here, the US keeps losing hard in an attack by China and Russia. Yet the Russian military can't even take on a country that's a fraction of its military size. So the idea of a Russian attack on a US base is not going to happen. And does anyone actually think that this country would dare attack a base of its number 1 trading partner? Instead of believing the FUD spread by some pundits, just go look at the numbers. That's all you do. Look at charts and numbers. That's all I'm doing. Thanks for watching. A lot of people are saying that the United States is collapsing from within, much like Rome did, due to all of this civil discontent. A lot of people aren't returning to the labor force. Violent crime has increased in a lot of our major cities. And everywhere you go on social media, you see that there's a huge political divide between the left and the right. Prices are rising across the board. Do you think America's going to survive it? You have to look back at U.S. history. Take a look at the 1960s and early 1970s at the Civil Rights Movement. The country was at each other's throats over whether or not African Americans should have the right to vote and if they have the right to go to the same school and use the same resources as everyone else. All of that was happening while the U.S. was actually at war in Vietnam. We had 500,000 of our troops there. The U.S. was spending 10% of its GDP just on that war. And at the apex of this time, we started going through massive gas shortages. But look, here we still are. Or what about events leading up to World War II? The whole world was brimming with war. The U.S. economy still wasn't recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment hit over 25% during that time. A lot of Americans don't know this, but we actually came very close to a socialist revolution during the Great Depression. There were riots in every major city. In every major city, there were massive demonstrations showing why socialism was better than capitalism. And the countries that were recovering fastest from the Great Depression were, of course, the totalitarian ones. Germany, Russia, Italy. And yet here we are, a capitalist country. So many hysterics in 20 and 21 were saying that we have never had crime like this before. Just look at this chart. Look how high the crime rates were in the 1990s, and look at where they are now. There was a slight bump up in 2020, and it went back down last year. I don't go much by unemployment. I go by the labor force participation rate, because that shows how many people are actually in the workforce. And you could see during COVID, there was a huge drop from 63% to 60%. But we've regained 2 percentage points. We're 1 percentage point away from being pre-COVID labor force levels. And usually when you're going to have some kind of social collapse, your GDP starts dropping significantly. If you look at year-by-year GDP growth, there was a small drop and then a jump back up. So when people are telling you that the world is going to end and things are really bad, just refer to history. The myth of a declining America has been prevalent since the 1950s. And the reason why that story keeps getting circulated is because it sells. Because people buy what they want to hear and they buy fear. Fear makes people more gullible. Fear also makes them a little bit more greedy. And it also makes them want to arm themselves more. Think about that. There is a lot of money to be made and influence gained from exploiting scared people. Thanks for watching.